I keep seeing these videos on YouTube claiming that the latest young generation, the Generation Z or Generation Z, is the weakest generation so far. And I have to say, I completely disagree with that. If you look at my grandparents' generation, it may seem like the world was highly ordered, everything was very effective, everybody knew their place, it just seemed to function very well on traditional values. And I keep hearing about the decline of all these traditional values and how the world and society appears to be crumbling, appears to be falling apart because of the loss of all these traditional values. But the truth is, although that world of my grandfathers and my grandmothers appeared to work very well, that generation was unbelievably brainwashed. They were like an entire generation of automatons. They could not think for themselves, even to save their lives, literally. That's why when the governments decided you're going to war, almost nobody questioned it. And the very minute number of individuals who did question it, they had to keep their mouths shut because they were just completely overwhelmed and massively outnumbered by people who could not think for themselves. When it came to my parents' generation, that was the first generation where young people actually had their own money. They had their own jobs that were paying enough money so they could be independent from their parents, and it gave them some freedom of choice and therefore allowed them to rebel against the traditional values of my grandparents. During the 60s, they could question all these imposed brainwash values. I'm not saying traditional values were wrong. There was a lot about the traditional values and the traditional mindset and the traditional morals that were superior to the way we live even today. The point I'm making is that people weren't thinking for themselves. They were just following them like robots. Now, it's interesting that my parents' generation was the first generation that said no to war. The Vietnam War was the first war stopped by public opinion because people were actually thinking for themselves, at least to some degree. When it got to my generation, we could see our grandparents' generation thinking they were completely brainwashed, our parents were semi-brainwashed, and we were thinking, probably quite conceitedly, that we could fully think for ourselves. But it's a progression. Generation by generation, people, members of those generations have been able to think more for themselves. That's just totally clear. Now, interestingly enough, between the 50s and the 90s, we had youth culture, where young people defined themselves and expressed their rebellion with their own culture, especially within music. And that seems to have disappeared, making it look like young people don't have their own values, when the truth is they just don't have enough to rebel against. Because after my generation, everything became so much freer, you didn't have to rebel. That's why youth culture has generally disappeared. It was based on rebellion. It was reactive rather than proactive. Culture has still continued. And after my generation, we had the millennials, and now we've got Generation Z or Generation Z. And I keep seeing these videos saying they are weaker. But they're not weaker. They're just overwhelmed with choice. There's more information because of the internet, and there is more choice than ever before. So it's very, very hard to make a decision, and it's very, very hard to focus. And so it appears that the Generation Z is weaker than the previous ones. They're certainly much more able to think for themselves, and I'll give you a very, very good example. When I was young, it was common for young people to ask each other, very simple question, what kind of music are you into? Now, I used to think, well, duh, I'm into good music. It doesn't matter what kind it is. And people would look at me thinking, what's the matter with you? You can't even make up your mind as to which genre of music you like. And I'm thinking, this is unbelievable. Why should I have to choose a genre and stick to it? Surely I can like music from many, many genres. I can think for myself. I don't need a prescribed genre just to enjoy music. Now that response now, if you ask the Generation Z, it's quite normal for them to pick and choose and like. And it's not a weakness. It's actually an ability to think for themselves and make up their own mind. The problem is, focusing is very, very difficult. It's much harder to make a choice. But there are very, very promising movements I've seen on the internet where, again, reaching the next level of human evolution or societal evolution, where young people can see the traditional values of the past that worked very, very well And now they can adopt them or readopt them out of choice. So they can create a moral system that works based on the ability to choose and think for yourself, not conditioned brainwashing like my grandparents' generation, and to a lesser degree, the generations that followed my grandparents. So my conclusion is, with every generation, young people are becoming more and more able to think for themselves, but they have a greater ocean of information and choices to make. And this is now the challenge faced by Generation Z.